Damian Cross didn't yell. He didn't throw anything. He just sat at the head of that anniversary dinner table, watching Elena pour 12 years of marriage down the drain. And the only thing he said was, "Put the ring back on. Not I love you. Not please don't go. Not even what did I do wrong. Just a command." Like she was one of his men who'd stepped out of line. Elena had survived 12 years in the shadow of the most feared crime boss in New York. She had smiled at dinners where men disappeared the next morning. She had kissed a husband who came home with blood under his fingernails and never asked where it came from. But tonight, she had found something Damian had spent 20 years burying. And the moment she placed that black envelope on the table between them, she watched the most dangerous man she had ever known go pale with fear. That was the moment everything changed. Not the ring. Not the words, the fear on his face. If you're watching this for the first time, welcome. If this is the kind of story that keeps you awake at night, hit that subscribe button right now and ring the notification bell so you never miss what's coming next. And do me a favor, drop a comment below and tell me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. Every comment means the world to me. Now let's go back to that penthouse. Because the night Elena Voss walked out on Damian Cross was only the beginning. The anniversary dinner had been Elena's idea. She was the one who had called the restaurant to cancel the reservation. She was the one who had told Damian's assistant to clear his evening. She was the one who had spent 3 hours that afternoon in the kitchen of the penthouse, cooking the one meal Damian had ever said, reminded him of being human, a simple pasta with a sauce his grandmother used to make before everything in his family turned ugly. She had done all of that knowing exactly what she was going to do by the end of the night. That was the part she couldn't explain to anyone, that she had cooked him dinner, that she had set the table with candles and the good crystal, that she had put on the ivory dress, the one he had always liked, and waited for him to come home. Not because she was wavering, because she needed to look him in the eyes one final time before she burned everything down. Damian arrived at 11:22 p.m., 20 minutes late, which for him was practically punctual. He wore a charcoal suit that probably cost more than most people's rent, and when he walked through the door, he brought with him the particular smell of cold air and cigarette smoke and something else. Elena had never been able to name the specific scent of a man who had spent his evening doing things that didn't bear discussing. He stopped when he saw the table, not surprised. Damian Cross was never surprised. He had trained himself out of that years ago because surprise was a luxury that got people killed. But there was something in the stillness that came over him when he registered the candles, the food, the way Elena was standing beside her chair in a dress. He recognized something that looked almost like grief, appearing for just a second before he locked it away behind his usual expression. "You cooked," he said. "Sit down, Damian." He looked at the champagne glasses. "What are we celebrating?" "Nothing," she said. "Sit down." He sat. That was one of the things that had always unnerved her, how easily Damian obeyed when the tone was right. People assumed he was the kind of man who never took direction from anyone. And for everyone else in his world, that was true. But Elena had discovered early in their marriage that there was a version of her voice, quiet and final, that reached something inside him he couldn't override. Some relic of the boy he'd been before all of this. He sat and he poured wine into neither of the champagne glasses, and he waited. Elena didn't sit. She stood across the table from him with her hands flat against the back of her chair, and she said, "I need to tell you something, and I need you to let me finish before you say anything." "Can you do that?" "Depends on what you say, Damian." A pause. He picked up his wine glass. Fine, she had rehearsed this. She had spent the better part of 2 weeks rehearsing it, in fact lying awake at 3 in the morning while he slept beside her, running through versions of this conversation the way other people count sheep. She had planned to be calm, measured, to lay out what she knew the way you'd present evidence in a courtroom, methodical and irrefutable. Instead, what came out of her mouth was, "I know about Adrian." The wineglass stopped halfway to his lips, just for a fraction of a second. Most people would have missed it. But Elena had spent 12 years studying Damian Cross, the way a scientist studies a fault line, watching for the tiny tremors that preceded something catastrophic. She hadn't missed it. He set the glass down slowly. "I don't know what you think you found. I'm not finished." His jaw tightened. He sat back. Elena reached into the inner pocket of the jacket, She draped over her chair and withdrew the black envelope. She set it on the table between them the way you might set down a grenade carefully, deliberately, watching his eyes the entire time. Damian's gaze dropped to it, and there it was again. That thing she had never seen on his face before. Not anger. Not calculation. Not the cold flatness he wore when someone in his organization had made a costly mistake. Fear, pure, unguarded animal fear. It appeared for no more than 3 seconds. Then his face went smooth and unreadable again, and when he looked back up at her, his voice was controlled. Where did you get that? From your study, behind the false panel in the bookcase. Something moved across his face, not quite anger, not quite betrayal. Like a man realizing he'd underestimated the person closest to him and wasn't sure yet whether to be furious or impressed. You went through my study. I've been through every room in this apartment, Elena said. I've had 8 months, Damian. You're not home very often. He was quiet for a moment. Then 8 months of what exactly? Of figuring out who you actually are. She watched that land. Watched it move through him. Damian Cross had heard many things said about him over the years, brutal things, accurate things, occasionally things so wrong they were almost funny. But this, apparently, was different. This sat somewhere that the other words hadn't reached. Elena, I said, let me finish. He closed his mouth. She pulled the envelope toward her, didn't open it. Just rested her hand on it the way you'd rest your hand on something you needed to remember was real. I know Adrian Cross didn't die in that warehouse fire. I know your mother didn't die when you were a child. I know the story you've been telling for 20 years, the orphaned brother, the tragic accident, all of it I know it's a lie. She paused. And I know you knew. You've always known. The silence that followed was the longest she had ever sat through in that apartment. Damian's right hand, resting on the table, curled slightly. Not into a fist. Something more controlled than that. Just the fingers bending inward, like he was trying to grip something that wasn't there. You have no idea what you're talking about, he said finally. But his voice had lost its certainty. It was thinner now. Like ice that has begun to crack at the edges, even though the surface still looks solid. Then explain it to me. He said nothing. 12 years, Elena said. 12 years I have been your wife. I have sat across from politicians and police commissioners, and men I knew were being paid to look the other way. And I smiled, and I played the part, and I told myself I was doing it because I believed in you. Because I thought underneath everything, you were... She stopped. Took a breath. I told myself a story about you, Damian. I told myself a very convenient story. You told yourself that story because it was true. No. Her voice didn't waver. I told myself that story because it was easier than admitting what I'd actually chosen. He stood up. Not threateningly, Damian rarely did anything that could be called threatening in the obvious sense. He simply rose from his chair and walked to the window and stood there with his back to her, looking down at the city in the rain. 23 floors below them, Manhattan shimmered and blurred through the water running down the glass. She waited. Whatever you think is in that envelope, he said, you don't have the full picture. I have enough of it. You have a fragment of something you don't understand yet. He turned to face her. Elena, I am genuinely asking you to put that envelope back where you found it and let me explain things in my own time. In my own way, your own time, she repeated. Yes. You've had 20 years. He had no answer for that. Elena walked to her chair and picked up her jacket. Then she reached for the envelope and slipped it back into her pocket. Damian watched her movements with the attention of a man trying to anticipate a threat. What are you doing? She found her bag where she'd left it near the entrance hall. Inside it, she'd packed 2 days' worth of essentials that afternoon. Just what she needed. Nothing sentimental, Elena. His voice had changed again. Harder now. Where do you think you're going? She came back to the table. She picked up her wedding ring. She had taken it off before he arrived home, left it beside her champagne glass, and she set it down at the center of the table. The sound it made was small, almost nothing, just a tiny clink of metal against wood. But Damian went absolutely still. Our marriage ends tonight, she said. He stared at the ring. You don't know what you're starting, he said. You don't know who else is looking for what's in that envelope. Elena, listen to me. There are people out there who would hurt you to get their hands on what you're carrying. People who are not like me, not like you, she said. Right. That's not what I meant. I know what you meant. She lifted her bag onto her shoulder. You meant that you would never physically hurt me. And you're probably right. That's probably even true. She met his eyes. But you've been hurting me in other ways for 12 years, Damian. You're just very good at making sure it doesn't leave marks. He took a step toward her. Don't do this here. Not tonight. When then? When would have been the right time? 5 years ago? 10? She shook her head. You would have talked me out of it. That's what you do. You find the exact right words for the exact right moment, and suddenly, everything seems more complicated than it actually is. She walked to the elevator and pressed the button. Damian stood in the middle of the room, and for a moment he looked nothing like the man the city feared. He looked like someone who had just realized he had miscalculated badly and couldn't find the move that corrected it. Elena, his voice was careful, precise, every word placed like a chess piece. If you walk out with that envelope, people will die. Not because I order it, because the people who want what's in it won't stop at anything to get it. Do you understand me? The elevator doors opened. She stepped inside. People have already died, Damian, because you kept it buried. She watched him through the gap as the doors began to close. I'm going to find Adrian, she said, and I'm going to give him everything that's in this envelope. The doors shut. She didn't see his face in that final second. But she heard something she had never heard in 12 years of marriage, a sound that came from somewhere behind the closing doors, low and involuntary. Something that sounded like a man breaking. She drove without music, without the radio, without anything to fill the silence of the car. The black envelope sat on the passenger seat. She kept glancing at it, the way you glance at something you can't quite believe is real. The rain came down in sheets now, turning the highway into a river of red taillights and gray water. Elena drove through it with both hands on the wheel, her mind running back over every conversation she'd had in the past 8 months, every piece she'd found, every moment she'd held back the things she knew, and smiled at Damian across breakfast like nothing was wrong. She had been a very good liar. The realization didn't make her proud. She had become exactly the kind of person you had to be to survive in Damian's world, someone who compartmentalized effortlessly, who showed one face at the dinner table and kept another face locked somewhere private where nobody could reach it. She hadn't even noticed it happening. That was the part that genuinely frightened her. The envelope had come to her through an accident. Not a dramatic one, nothing cinematic about it. A water pipe had burst in the building's storage level 4 floors below the penthouse, and the property manager had called to say they'd need access to the floor to assess damage to some of the unit's stored items. Elena had gone down herself because Damian was in Boston, and his men made her feel like a prisoner whenever she had them handle things she could handle herself. The water damage was minor, but when she moved a set of boxes to check the wall behind them, she found a seam in the drywall that didn't match the surrounding surface. She hadn't opened it that day. She'd stood there looking at it for almost 5 minutes, and then she'd stacked the boxes back and gone upstairs and made herself a cup of tea and sat at the kitchen counter for a very long time thinking about what kind of woman opens a hidden compartment in her husband's building without his knowledge. She'd gone back down 2 days later. Inside was a fireproof box. Inside the box was the envelope, and inside the envelope was a photograph that changed the shape of everything she thought she knew. Adrian Cross in the photograph looked about 40. He was standing outside what appeared to be a European train station, and beside him, with her hand on his arm, was a woman Elena recognized from the one-framed photograph. Damian kept locked in his desk drawer, the only photograph he owned of his family, the one he had shown her exactly once in the early days of their marriage, when he'd been, briefly, the kind of open that people sometimes are when they think they might be falling in love. His mother. The woman who had supposedly died of a heart condition when Damian was 7 years old. The woman in the photograph was very much alive, and the photograph had been taken according to the date printed in the bottom corner just 6 years ago. Elena had sat in that storage room on the floor among the water-damaged boxes and looked at that photograph for a long time. She had looked at the hospital bracelet that was also in the envelope, a newborn's bracelet, faded with age, with a name that hit her like a physical thing, Adrian Cross, born March 4. She had looked at the ledger page, with its columns of numbers and names, and at the bottom, circled in red ink and handwriting. She recognized as Damian's was a single line, "Never existed, fire closes this, never existed." She had driven home that evening and made dinner and set the table and sat across from her husband and watched him eat, and she had felt For the first time in 12 years, like she was looking at a stranger. That had been 8 months ago. She had spent those 8 months being methodical, being careful, learning things the way she imagined investigators learned them, one thread at a time, following each strand back to where it connected with the next. She had taken nothing out of the apartment. She had photographed documents on her phone and then cleared the photographs to a secure cloud account Damian didn't know existed. She had made calls from phones she bought with cash. She had gradually and painstakingly begun to understand the architecture of the lie. And the more she understood it, the more she understood that what she was dealing with was not just a secret. It was a structure, a deliberate, maintained structure built over 2 decades, with multiple people invested in keeping it standing. One of those people was Damian. But Damian she had come to believe, though the belief felt unstable, like ground that might shift under her weight, was not the architect. She turned off the highway. The address she was going to was one she'd found only 3 weeks ago, buried in the ledger entries, cross-referenced against property records she'd found through a contact she'd made years ago, during Damian's one brush with formal legal trouble. A paralegal named Greta, who had once told her, over 2 glasses of wine, "If you ever need to find something in this city that someone doesn't want found, I know how to find it." Elena had called Greta. The townhouse in Queens had been registered under a name that didn't appear anywhere else in Damian's documented world. But the ledger tied it clearly, the address, the year, the same red ink handwriting. This was a place Damian's family had used, maybe still used. She pulled up to the address and sat for a moment outside in the dark car, with the engine running and the rain drumming on the roof. The townhouse was dark. It looked like it had been dark for years, the kind of darkness that comes from a building that has been deliberately avoided rather than simply unoccupied. Curtains drawn. No lights on any timer. Not a single visible sign of recent life. She turned the engine off. She told herself, as she had told herself every step of the past 8 months, that she knew what she was doing. It was not entirely true. The front door was unlocked. That was the first thing that gave her pause, not locked, not forced, just unlocked, as though someone had expected her. Or expected someone. Inside smelled of old wood and something dusty and sealed, the specific smell of rooms that haven't been properly aired in years. The furniture was covered in white sheets that had gone gray with dust. The floors were old hardwood that creaked under her feet. She moved through the front room toward the staircase, guided by the small flashlight she'd brought, running the beam across the floor. The ledger had been specific, 3rd floorboard from the left, measured from the foot of the staircase. She counted, crouched down, pressed along the edge of the board until she felt the give a slight, deliberate looseness, the kind that was engineered rather than accidental. She was working her fingers under the board when headlights swept across the curtains. She killed the flashlight instantly, pressed herself against the base of the staircase. Outside, a car, 2 cars pulling up, engines cutting. The particular sound of multiple car doors opening and closing in quick, organized succession. Trained people. People who moved efficiently. She was already reaching for her phone when it rang. Damian. She pressed it to her ear without a word. "Get out of the house." His voice was stripped of everything: the authority, the control, the performance. Just bare words pushed through a phone at a woman crouching in the dark. "Right now. Don't take anything. Just get out." What? Elena. The urgency in that single word hit her like a hand on the shoulder. "Those aren't my men outside." "What do you mean they're not your?" The front door did not open so much as cease to exist. It came inward with a sound like a short explosion, the frame splintering, the hinges giving, and in the half-second of stunned silence that followed, Elena was already moving. Not thinking. Moving. Down the hallway toward the back of the house, away from the light that came flooding in from the ruined doorway. She heard voices short, clipped, in the tone of men who do this for work and aren't alarmed yet. They were checking rooms, systematic. She had maybe 30 seconds. She went back to the staircase, found the board. Her hands were shaking, but her mind had gone to a very cold, very clear place, the same place it went in the worst moments of her marriage, when she'd had to be calm because Damian was not capable of calm and someone had to be. 3rd board, the give. She yanked it up. The compartment beneath was shallow. Inside, wrapped in a cloth that had once been black, but had faded to a mottled gray, was a box. She grabbed it. She moved to the kitchen. The back door was old and she hit it harder than she meant to, bursting out into the alley behind the house and into the rain and the dark and the smell of wet garbage and old concrete. Behind her, inside the house, someone shouted. She ran. Not gracefully, not in a straight line. She ran the way people who aren't trained to run actually run, lurching. One hand on the box, one arm pumping. Her shoes wrong for this, her dress wrong, for everything about this moment. She made it to the end of the alley before she heard something that stopped her in place. A sound from inside the house she had just left. A single gunshot. She pressed herself against the wall at the alley's edge. Her heart was so loud she could barely hear anything over it. She waited. Silence. Then footsteps, one set, moving fast toward the back of the house. Toward her. She rounded the corner at a run. She almost collided with the man stepping out of a black car at the alley mouth. She pulled back. He grabbed her arm, not roughly but firmly, the grip of someone who doesn't want you to fall. Elena Voss. She had never heard that voice before. A man she had never seen, older maybe 55, 60. Lean. A scar through one eyebrow. Tired eyes that had seen things and not recovered from seeing them. You have the box, he said. She pulled her arm back. He let her. Who are you? He looked at her for a moment in the rain. Then he said, My name is Adrian Cross. She stared at him. He was nothing like she'd imagined. In her mind, over 8 months of building a picture of this man from fragments and photographs and a 20-year-old recording she hadn't yet heard, she had constructed something monstrous. Someone who matched the scale of the secret. Someone you would recognize immediately as the kind of person around whom histories fracture. The man in front of her was just a man, worn down. Careful. Standing in the rain outside a burning building, she smelled it now. The smoke starting to pour from the back of the townhouse, with his hands at his sides and his eyes on the box she was carrying. You're supposed to be dead, she said. The words came out stupidly, like the opener of a bad conversation. But they were the only words she had. I know, he said. Get in the car. She didn't move. I'm not going anywhere with a stranger. You're standing in the rain next to a house that's on fire with 3 armed men inside, who were not sent by your husband, he said very patiently. You can stand here and sort out the etiquette later, or you can get in the car. She looked back at the smoke billowing from the townhouse windows. She got in the car. He drove. She sat in the passenger seat with the box on her lap and her wet hair dripping onto the seat and her mind running fast and going nowhere, like an engine revved in neutral. Neither of them spoke for the first several minutes. Finally, she said, You knew I was going to be there. I've been watching the house for 3 weeks, he said, waiting to see if anyone came. Were you watching me specifically? He glanced at her. I knew Damian's wife had started asking questions about 8 months ago. Yes. She absorbed that. How? Because when you asked Greta to run the property records, Greta called someone who eventually reached a person who has been helping me manage my continued existence for 20 years. He said it simply, without drama. You have good instincts. You got there almost the same way I did 20 years ago. And where did it get you? He was quiet for a long moment. A warehouse fire, he said, and a long time of being nobody. She looked at the box in her lap. Her hands had stopped shaking. What's in this? She asked. You don't know? I found it tonight. I didn't have time to open it. He nodded slowly, pulled the car off the main road onto a smaller one. Open it, he said. She worked the latch. The box was old, but the mechanism held someone had maintained it. Inside, on a bed of faded cloth, was a cassette recorder. The kind that had been common in the 80s and 90s. Small black, with a tape already loaded, she picked up. There's a button on the side, Adrian said, was watching the road. Not looking at her, she found it. She pressed play. The recording was old. There was hiss and a slight warble to the audio. But the voice was clear enough, and the moment it reached her ears, she felt the bottom drop out of whatever remained of her certainty about the man she had married. Damian's voice. Young, maybe 19 or 20. She had heard old recordings of him before, a few, from his legal depositions, and the voice was recognizable, even softened by youth. He said, If Adrian ever comes back, he'll destroy everything. A pause. Traffic noise somewhere in the background of the recording. Then, quieter, he knows what I did to our father. The recording clicked off. Sina sat in the passenger seat of a car driven by a dead man, holding a cassette recorder with her husband's voice on it, and outside the rain kept falling on a city that knew nothing about any of this. She thought about the ivory dress, about the pasta getting cold on the anniversary table, about the exact way Damian's face had looked when she put the black envelope down in front of him. That fear. She understood now what had been behind it. Not exposure, not losing the empire, not even losing her. He had been afraid because somewhere in a cassette recorder, in a hidden box, in a house he'd spent 20 years staying away from, was the sound of his own voice saying the thing that had been eating him alive since before she ever knew him. She pressed the cassette recorder into her lap. "He didn't kill your father, did he?" she said. It wasn't quite a question. Adrian's hands tightened on the steering wheel. "No," he said, "he didn't. Then who did?" Adrian looked at the road ahead for a long moment. "That's what the box is about to help you prove," he said. She looked at the cassette recorder. The rain hammered the car roof. And somewhere behind them, in the rearview mirror, Adrian kept checking. A pair of headlights appeared and stayed a constant distance, matching their speed exactly through every turn. Adrian noticed it before she did. His jaw tightened. "Don't look back," he said quietly. "Are they following us?" "They've been following us for the past 4 miles. She gripped the box. "Victor's men?" Adrian didn't answer immediately. She was learning. How Adrian answered questions he found dangerous. "Possibly," he said. "Who is Victor?" He glanced at her then. A look that was hard to read, part assessment, part something that might have been pity. "Victor Hale," he said. "Your husband's closest lieutenant. The man who has been running Damian's organization, from inside Damian's organization for the past 20 years. She stared at him. "And the man," Adrian said, his voice going very flat and careful, "who killed our father." The headlights in the mirror stayed constant. Elena looked at the recorder in her lap, and at the black envelope still in her coat pocket, and at the man beside her who had been dead for 20 years, and she understood, with a clarity that felt like cold water over her entire body, that she had not walked out of her marriage tonight. She'd walked into something that had been waiting for her, for all of them for 20 years. She pressed the cassette recorder back into the box and closed the latch. "Where are we going?" she asked. Adrian checked the mirror again. "Somewhere I can explain everything," he said, "if we lose them." He turned the wheel sharply. The headlights in the mirror swerved to follow. Elena held the box with both hands and did not look back. Adrian lost them somewhere near the Queensboro Bridge. Not cleanly, nothing about the next 40 minutes was clean. He ran 2 red lights, cut through a parking garage on 43rd that had an exit on a different street, and at one point pulled into a loading dock behind a restaurant supply warehouse and killed the engine and the lights, and they sat there in the dark for 11 minutes without speaking, while a cat picked through a dumpster 10 feet away, and the rain kept falling, and the headlights they'd been watching never reappeared. Elena counted the 11 minutes on the clock in the dash. She didn't ask questions during those 11 minutes. She didn't panic. She sat with the box in her lap, and her wet hair cooling against her neck, and she breathed carefully, deliberately, the way she'd taught herself to breathe in the early years of her marriage, when she'd had to learn that panic was a luxury she couldn't afford. Adrian watched the garage entrance. His hands stayed on the wheel, even after the engine was off. Finally, he said, "We're clear. Are you sure?" "No," he said. "But we're as clear as we're going to get tonight." He started the car. She let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. He drove them out of the city through surface streets, avoiding highways, taking a route that felt deliberately indirect. Elena stopped trying to track where they were going after the first 20 minutes. She didn't know Queens well enough. She focused instead on the man beside her, the way he drove, the way he checked the mirrors with a rhythm that suggested long practice, the way his face never showed anything beyond a kind of tight, focused attention that was different from Damian's control. Damian's control was performative. It was built for rooms. Adrian's attention was something quieter and more fundamental, the watchfulness of a man who had spent 20 years making himself hard to find. "You said Victor killed your father," she said. "I did." Damian didn't know. "At the time, no." "At the time," she repeated. "What does that mean?" He didn't answer immediately. She was beginning to understand that his silences weren't evasions, not exactly. They were the pauses of a man who had learned to be very careful about which version of the truth he gave to which person. "It means things get complicated," he said. "Things are already complicated." More complicated than you're thinking right now. She turned to look at him directly. Adrian, I just walked out on a 12-year marriage, escaped armed men in a burning house, and I'm sitting in a car with a man who has been legally dead for 20 years. You can be straight with me. He glanced at her. Something shifted slightly in his expression, not warmth exactly, but a kind of recalibration, like he was adjusting his assessment of her. Damian found out about Victor 2 years after the fact, he said. Not all of it, but enough. He found out that Victor had been involved in what happened to our father. Elena went still, and he covered it up, she said. He covered it up. Why? Because by the time he found out, Victor was indispensable. Victor had built the organization's infrastructure, the legal fronts, the money channels, the political relationships. Damian was 21 years old and had inherited an empire he barely understood yet. And the one man who knew how all of it worked had committed the crime. Damian was already being held responsible for covering up. He paused. If Damian exposed Victor, he exposed himself, and the organization collapsed. And 20 years of his family's work, whatever you think about what that work was, went to nothing. So he chose the empire. He chose survival. They're not always the same thing, but at 21 they felt like it. Elena looked at the box in her lap. And you, she said. You were already gone by then. I was already gone. Where did you go? Away, different places. For a long time I just moved. Stayed in places long enough to work, short enough that nobody could establish anything about me. He said it flatly, without self-pity, the way you describe weather. Europe for a while. South America for a while. I have a face that doesn't look like much. That helped. She thought about that, about what it meant to be 20-something years old and forced out of your own life and your own name. About the specific weight of living as nobody for 20 years, because the alternative was dying as yourself. You must hate him, she said. Adrian was quiet for a long moment. I used to, he said. For a long time it was the thing that got me up in the morning. He checked the mirror. Then it turned into something else, something more useful. What patience, he said. They drove in silence for a while after that. The motel was 40 minutes outside the city, close enough to the highway that you could hear her truck passing in the night, far enough that nobody who wasn't specifically looking for it would find it. The kind of place that rented rooms by the week and didn't ask questions if the credit card cleared. Adrian had clearly used it before he pulled in at an angle that put the car's plates facing away from the road, a habit so ingrained he probably didn't notice he was doing it. He'd reserved 2 rooms, adjacent. He handed her the key to the first one without ceremony and said he'd be in the next room if she needed to talk. Elena stood in the door of her room for a moment and looked at it. Single bed, rough carpet, a bathroom with a light fixture that buzzed. A painting bolted to the wall above the bed, one of those generic mountain landscapes that exist in motels across the country, as though chosen specifically to remind you that you are nowhere that matters. She set the box on the bed. She sat beside it. She picked up the cassette recorder and listened to the recording again. Then a third time. He knows what I did to our father. She turned the recorder over in her hands. What Damian had done was cover up a murder. Stay quiet about a crime. Choose an empire over a brother and call it survival. None of that was nothing. But there was a version of a man in those choices, a young, frightened, badly positioned man who made a catastrophic decision and then spent 20 years trapped inside it that she could almost understand. Almost, she didn't sleep much. When she did, it was in the clothes she was wearing, the ivory dress creased beyond recovery, the box on the pillow beside her. Morning came gray and wet. The rain had followed them out of the city, or never stopped, she couldn't tell which. She was standing at the window with a cup of motel coffee when she heard the knock at the connecting door. Come in. Adrian entered. He looked like he'd slept even less than she had. He was carrying 2 paper bags that smelled of gas station, food egg sandwiches, wrapped in foil, more coffee. He set them on the small table by the window without comment. She appreciated that. She wasn't in the mood for pleasantries, and apparently neither was he. They ate in silence for a moment. Then Adrian said, Victor knows you have the box. She looked at him. How? Because those men last night weren't sent blind. They knew exactly what house to go to and exactly what to look for. He set down his coffee. Someone told Victor that the townhouse was relevant. And the only people who knew about that house, the only people who could have connected you to it, are people inside Damian's organization. Or Damian himself. Damian didn't send those men, Adrian said. I believe that. Why? Because if Damian had wanted to take the box back from you, he would have done it before you left the penthouse. He looked at her steadily. Your husband has his failings. Decisiveness when he thinks he needs something is not one of them. If he'd wanted to take the envelope from you, he would have taken it. She thought about that, about the way Damian had stood in the middle of the room and watched her walk to the elevator. How he'd spoken urgent but not commanding, like a man trying to warn someone rather than stop them. He knew they were coming, she said slowly. I think he knew Victor was moving. Not the specific target, not the specific timing. Adrian broke a piece off his sandwich, which means Damian and Victor are no longer aligned, which changes things significantly. How do you know any of this? I've spent 20 years watching your husband's organization. Not constantly, I couldn't afford that, but consistently. I have people I trust. They tell me things. She studied him. You built a network. I built what I needed to stay alive long enough to be useful. Useful for what? He looked at her. For this, he said simply. She set down her coffee. You've been waiting for this moment, she said. For someone to find the box. I've been waiting for Damian to reach a point where his interests and mine converged. Where he had more to gain from the truth coming out than from keeping it buried. He paused. I couldn't force that. I could only wait. And you think this is that moment. I think Victor jumping the gun tells me he's running out of time on something. Victor doesn't move sloppily. He moved sloppily last night. That means he's scared. And when Victor Hale is scared, he does things that can be used against him. Elena leaned back in her chair. The gray light from the window fell across the table, across the remains of their breakfast, across the box sitting on the bed 10 feet away. She looked at Adrian's face in that light, the scar through his eyebrow. The particular stillness of someone who has made a long peace with patience. She said, What do you need from me? He was quiet for a moment. I need you to contact Damian. No, Elena, I said no. Her voice didn't rise. It went flatter, which was a thing she'd learned from 12 years of watching Damian handle rooms. I'm not going back to him. I'm not using myself as a way to get to him. I'm not a piece in whatever you're playing. I'm not asking you to go back to him. Adrian held her eyes. I'm asking you to call him. One conversation. Because Damian has information. We need information that isn't in the box. What information? There's a second ledger. He said it simply, like he'd been waiting for the right moment to put it down on the table. The box has the recording and the first set of accounts. But the original full ledger, the one that documents every transaction, Victor ran through the organization's legitimate fronts. Going back to the beginning, Damian has it. He's kept it as insurance. She stared at him. You know about it. I've known about it for 3 years. I've been trying to find a way to get to it without getting killed. He paused. You are the one person Damian Cross would give it to. You don't know that. You're the one person who just walked out on him, and he didn't send men after. Yes, I do. Elena stood up. She walked to the window. Outside, a truck was pulling out of the motel lot, and for a few seconds the rumble of it filled the room, and she used those seconds to think. She turned back. If I call him, she said, he'll want to meet. Yes, and if we meet, you want to be there. Yes. And if you're there, she said carefully, you understand that I cannot predict what he does. 20 years is a long time. I don't know what Damian does when he sees you. I don't know if that meeting stays controlled. Adrian looked at her steadily. Neither do I, he said. That doesn't bother you? Something crossed his face. Not quite grief, not quite resolution. Something that had taken a long time to settle into its current shape. I've had 20 years to think about what I'd say to my brother if I ever got the chance, he said. I'm not going to waste it. She called Damian at 9:10. He picked up on the first ring. She heard something in the immediacy of it, that she hadn't expected. He had been waiting, holding the phone and waiting. Are you safe? He said. Yes. Where? I'm not telling you where I am. A silence. Then okay, she'd braced for argument, for the commanding tone, the carefully constructed logic he deployed when he wanted to move her towards something. Instead, just okay. The single word of a man who understood for the first time that he had run out of leverage. Victor sent men to the townhouse, she said, I know. Did you know he was going to? No. A pause. I knew he was making moves I hadn't authorized. I didn't know the specific target until my people called me from the scene. His voice tightened almost imperceptibly. Are you hurt? No. I have it. A breath. something releasing on his end of the line. Listen to me, Damian said. Elena, whatever is in that box, whatever you found Victor is not going to stop. He's been building towards something for a long time. And I think this is it. I think he's moving now because he believes he has enough to. He stopped, restarted. He's going to try to take the organization, and he's going to eliminate anyone who can contradict his version of events. His version of events, she repeated. Meaning what? Meaning if Victor controls the narrative going forward, there is no record of what he did 20 years ago. There is no box. There is no recording. There is nothing. His voice was careful, precise, but underneath it she could hear something she'd heard only once or twice in 12 years, Damian genuinely afraid. Not performing fear for effect. Actually afraid. He can't let the box survive. And he can't let you survive with it. She gripped the phone. Damian, there's a ledger. A second one, the original full accounts. You have it, silence. Longer than she expected. Who told you that? Does it matter? Yes, he said. It matters quite a lot. Because the only people who know that ledger exists are people inside my organization. Which means he stopped again. A different kind of silence this time. Working silence. The sound of a very sharp mind running at full speed. You're with someone. I'm safe. That's not what I asked. His voice changed. Something harder entering it. You're with someone who knows the inside of my organization, who knew about the townhouse, and who knew the ledger exists. There are 3 people alive who fit that description, Elena. 3 people, and one of them is Victor. She said nothing. She heard him breathe. Elena, very quiet now. Tell me you are not with the other one. She looked at Adrian, who was watching her from across the room, with the still attention of someone who can read a conversation from one side. She said, we need to meet. All 3 of us. The silence that followed was enormous. When Damian finally spoke, his voice had gone somewhere she'd never heard it go before. Somewhere stripped of everything, below the anger and the calculation and the fear, down to something raw and structural. He's alive, Damian said. It wasn't a question. It was the sound of a man's understanding of 20 years of his own life rearranging itself. Yes, he's been alive this whole time. Yes, another silence. Then barely audible, does he know? Does he know I didn't? Damian, she cut him off, not cruelly, precisely. He knows. But we need to talk about what we do now, not about 20 years ago. There isn't time. A very long pause where, Damian said. They agreed on a location, a warehouse space in Newark that belonged to a front company, disconnected enough from Damian's main organization that Victor wouldn't have eyes on it. Damian had to come alone, a condition he accepted without argument, which told Elena more about the state of things than any admission he could have made. They drove to Newark in the afternoon. Adrian said almost nothing on the drive. Once halfway there, he said, "You did well on the call." "I didn't do anything," she said. "I just told him the truth." That was the hard part, he said. They arrived before Damian. The warehouse was empty, metal shelving stripped bare, concrete floor, gray light coming through translucent panels in the roof. It smelled of old machine oil and concrete dust. Elena stood in the center of it and looked up at the roof panels and thought about how many rooms like this she had been adjacent to during her marriage without ever actually standing inside one. The infrastructure of a world she'd lived on the edges of for 12 years. Adrian stayed near the door. She heard the car before she saw it. A single car, the engine cutting. One set of footsteps on the gravel outside. Damian came through the door. He had changed his clothes since last night. Dark jacket, dark shirt. He looked composed. He always looked composed when he entered a room. It was one of the most fundamental things about him, but he was carrying something different beneath the composure. Something visible if you knew where to look. He saw Elena first. He stopped. His eyes moved to Adrian and stayed there. Elena had tried to imagine this moment, in the car during the drive. She'd tried to anticipate what it would look like when 2 brothers who hadn't seen each other in 20 years, who had both believed at various points that the other was dead, stood in the same room again. She'd expected something operatic, some large visible rupture of feeling. What she got was 2 men standing approximately 20 feet apart, looking at each other, in a silence so complete she could hear the rain starting again on the roof panels. Damian's composure didn't crack, but something behind it moved. Something she recognized from the night she had put the black envelope on the anniversary table, that same unguarded thing that appeared briefly when his defenses registered something they couldn't account for. "You're old," Damian said. Adrian looked at him. "You are too," he said. Another silence. Then Damian looked at Elena, the box. "Not yet," Adrian said. Damian's eyes moved back to his brother. The composure reassembled around something colder. "You don't give me instructions? I'm not giving instructions." Adrian didn't move from where he stood. "I'm telling you the order of things. We talk first, then the box. The order of things." Damian said it with a particular flatness that Elena knew from experience was not quite contempt and not quite something else. 20 years, Adrian. You've been alive for 20 years and you didn't. I know. You didn't send a word, not one. I thought you were dead. I believed you were dead. I know that too. Then why? Because I didn't know if you'd sent me there, Adrian said. Quietly, directly, to the warehouse, to the fire. I didn't know whose idea it was, and I couldn't come back to find out until I had enough to protect myself if the answer was the wrong one. Damian went very still. The word came out of him low and deliberate. You thought I tried to kill you. For about 4 years, yes. And then I started finding out about Victor, Adrian said. And things got more complicated. Elena watched Damian's face during this exchange. She had spent 12 years reading Damian Cross, becoming fluent in the private language of his expressions, and she could see what this information was doing to him, the specific injury of learning that his brother had spent years believing him capable of fratricide. Not guilt, something deeper than guilt. The raw cellular shock of understanding that the people who know you can still build versions of you that you don't recognize. I would never have hurt you, Damian said. I believe that now. But you didn't then. No. Adrian met his eyes. And you have to sit with that. What you'd built, what you'd chosen to be, it made that a reasonable thing for your own brother to believe about you. The silence after that was different from the ones before it. Heavier. The kind of silence that forms when something true has been said and nobody has a good answer for it. Damian turned and walked a few steps. Not away, just movement. The particular movement of a man trying to find a position in his body that matches something he's trying to hold together internally. He turned back. Victor, he said, what do you know? Adrian looked at Elena. She opened the box. She took out the cassette recorder. She set it on a metal shelf within reach of all three of them. The recording proves Victor was present at the warehouse the night your father died, Adrian said. And the first ledger documents the accounts he ran through the organization in the years following the ones he told you were standard business that you never had full access to because they were above your clearance at the time. I know about the accounts, Damian said. You know about some of them, Adrian said. Not all. Because Victor kept 2 sets. The ones he showed you as your organization grew, and the ones he kept for himself. He paused. Over 20 years, Victor has been quietly building a parallel financial structure, using the organization's infrastructure to run his own operations on the side. Money that never touched your ledgers. Relationships with people who answer to Victor, not to you. Damian's jaw tightened. How much, he said. Enough to fund a complete transition. If Victor removes you from the equation, if he controls the narrative, eliminates the box, eliminates everyone who can contradict him, he inherits an organization that has no idea it's changed hands. Damian stared at the shelf where the recorder sat. He was going to replace me, he said. Not a question. Just the flat recognition of a thing clicking into place. He's been preparing to replace you for at least 5 years, Adrian said. The last 2 years he's been accelerating. Whatever he's planning, it's close. A muscle moved in Damian's cheek. Elena watched him process it, watched the coldness that came over him, the particular focus of a man who has just located his enemy precisely and is realigning everything toward it. She had always found that version of Damian frightening. Right now, standing in a warehouse in Newark in the rain, she found it almost reassuring. The second ledger, she said. Damian, we need it. He looked at her. For a moment, just a moment, the focus broke, and he was looking at her the way he'd looked at her last night, not as a strategist, not as a crime boss calculating odds, but as a man looking at the person who had walked out on him and trying to find the right thing to say in a context where there were no right things. I know, he said. Where is it? He looked at Adrian, then back at Elena. Victor's people have been watching my main properties for 3 days, he said. I noticed the surveillance 48 hours ago. I didn't know why until last night. He paused. The ledger is in my office safe, in the penthouse. Adrian and Elena looked at each other. Can you get to it? Elena asked. I can get to the building, Damian said. Whether I can get into the penthouse without Victor knowing is a different question. He has people watching the entrances. At least 4 I've identified. Your own building, Adrian said. He's been thorough. Damian's voice was absolutely even. I'll give him that, Elena thought. There's the service entrance, she said. Both men looked at her. On the building's north side, there's a freight elevator that opens on a separate system. I used it once when there was flooding in the main lobby. She paused. Victor's people would watch the main entrances. Maybe the parking level. Would they know about the freight system? Damian considered it. It's not documented in anything connected to my files. It's a building operations system. He looked at her. How do you know about it? Because I paid attention, she said. I paid attention to a lot of things you didn't know I was paying attention to. Something moved across Damian's face, not quite a smile. The ghost of one. All right, he said. They worked out the logistics. It took 30 minutes, and the 30 minutes were tense in the specific way of people who are not used to cooperating with each other, trying to cooperate under pressure. Damian and Adrian spoke directly to each other only when they had to. Elena found herself serving as a kind of translator, not of language but of tone, smoothing the edges of exchanges that kept threatening to tip into something older and more complicated than the immediate problem required. It was exhausting work. By the time they had a plan, rough as it was, full of the kinds of gaps that plans made under pressure, always have, it was late afternoon, and the rain had gotten serious. And they were 3 people who had not properly slept standing in a warehouse in Newark, holding a plan that depended on things going right that had a significant probability of going wrong. Adrian said he would wait at the motel. Damian said nothing to his brother as they prepared to leave. At the door, Adrian stopped. He had his back to the room, one hand on the door frame. Without turning, Damian stopped. I don't need you to explain 20 years, Adrian said. I'm not here for that. A pause. But I need to know one thing. When you found out what Victor did, when you actually knew, not suspected, was there a part of you that was relieved? The question sat in the warehouse air. Elena watched Damian's face. For the first time since he'd walked through that door, something cracked through the surface. Not breaking Damian Cross did not break in front of people. But a fracture, visible, honest. Yes, he said. Adrian nodded once. He walked out. Damian stood where he was for a moment. Then he turned to Elena. When this is over, he said, and then he stopped. Don't, she said quietly. He closed his mouth. She walked past him to the door. They drove to the city separately. Elena followed Damian's car through the rain, maintaining a distance, watching the city come back up around them. As they crossed the bridge, the lights, the density, the particular energy of Manhattan at night that had once seemed glamorous, and now seemed like the surface of something that concealed enormous machinery grinding away in the dark underneath. The freight elevator was exactly where she remembered it. The access panel required a code she'd seen a maintenance worker punch in 2 years ago, on the day of the flooding, another thing she'd filed away without thinking, without intending to. Just a woman paying attention to the world around her, because that was the kind of woman she was, and had always been, even when the world around her gave her reasons to look away. The code worked. They rode up in silence. The penthouse was dark when they entered. Elena stayed near the elevator, while Damian moved directly to his study. She listened to the building, its sounds, its particular silence, the ambient hum of a high floor in a city tower at night. She heard Damian open the safe. She heard the sounds of paper moving. And she heard something else. A sound from the main elevator shaft. A mechanical sound. The elevator moving, coming up. She was across the room and into the study doorway in seconds. Someone's in the elevator, she said. Damian was already on his feet, the ledger thick, bound in black in one hand, his phone in the other. He read whatever notification had come through, and his face changed. Victor, he said. Not surprised. Something past surprise. The recognition of a man who has finally confirmed the exact shape of the thing that has been closing around him. How many, she said. Building security just sent an alert. 4 people came through the lobby. They didn't stop at the desk. Your security bot, Damian said, simply, without visible anger, which was somehow worse. Or scared. Victor's had 3 years to work on them. Elena looked at the study door, at the hallway beyond it, at the main elevator indicator above the doors across the room, the light beginning to move upward through the floors. 23, 22, 20. She looked at Damian. The freight elevator, she said. He grabbed the ledger. They moved. 15 feet from the freight elevator door, the main elevator chimed. The doors began to open. Elena hit the freight elevator button, and they stepped inside, and the doors began their slow hydraulic close, and through the narrowing gap, she saw the main elevator doors finish opening, and a man step out, not Victor, not yet. Someone she didn't recognize in a dark jacket, with something in his hand, and he turned and saw the gap, saw Damian's face through it, and he started across the room, and the freight elevator doors met and sealed, and the car began to drop. Damian stood beside her, in the small metal box, the ledger pressed against his side, and the elevators descended through the building in a mechanical whir. She could hear her own pulse. 18 floors, 12. 7. The elevator stopped at 2, not the ground floor. 2, it just stopped. The motor hummed and went quiet. Elena and Damian looked at each other in the overhead light of a halted freight elevator, with 4 of Victor's men above them in the penthouse, and one ledger between them and the ground floor nowhere close. Damian reached up and opened the access panel in the ceiling. "Give me your hand," he said. She gave him her hand, and they climbed. The shaft was cold and smelled of grease and old metal. Elena went up first because Damian put his hands under her feet and pushed, and she grabbed the edge of the ceiling opening and pulled, and there was nothing elegant about any of it. Her dress tore at the hip, her palms burned against the metal lip, and she came up onto the roof of the elevator car, on her hands and knees in the dark, with her heart going so fast she could feel it in her teeth. Damian came up after her. Faster, stronger, the ledger tucked under one arm and his other hand, finding the edge in the dark with the precision of someone who had at some earlier point in his life practiced moving through spaces that weren't meant to be moved through. They crouched on top of the halted car in the shaft. Below them, the elevator sat at the second floor. Above, through the gridwork of cables and counterweights, the distant sound of movement, voices, footsteps filtered down from the penthouse level. Victor's men working through the apartment, methodical, not panicking. The sound of people who believed they had time. Damian's mouth was close to her ear. Service ladder. North wall of the shaft. Should be 3 feet to your left. She felt for it in the dark. Found it iron rungs set into the concrete going down. Ground floor? She breathed. Basement parking. We can get out through the loading dock. They went down the ladder, one after the other, feeling for each rung, the shaft around them, humming with the mechanical presence of the buildings. Somewhere above them, the elevator motor kicked on again, someone calling the car back up, and the cable beside Elena's head began to move, and she pressed herself against the ladder and felt the air displacement of it inches from her face. They hit the basement level. A door, not locked from this side, and they came through it into the parking structure, fluorescent lights, the smell of exhaust and concrete sealer, a handful of cars in assigned spaces. Damian was already moving toward the loading dock exit. Elena followed. Outside, the rain had gone from serious to committed. The loading dock opened onto a service alley that ran along the back of the building's block, and they moved down it at a pace that wasn't quite running. Running attracted attention, even in New York, even at this hour, and at the end of the alley. Damian flagged a cab with a directness that managed to look routine, despite the fact that his jacket was hanging wrong from the ledger, tucked inside it, and Elena's dress had a 6-inch tear up the left side. The cab driver looked at them in the rearview mirror, and then looked at the road and said nothing. New York. In the back of the cab, Damian texted someone, one of his remaining loyal people, Elena assumed, watching the focused economy of his movements. 3 messages. Short. He held the phone so she couldn't read the screen, which was habit rather than intention, she thought, or hoped. She said very quietly, "Does Victor know about Adrian?" Damian looked up from the phone. "What? Does Victor know Adrian is alive?" A pause. She watched him genuinely think about it, running back through whatever internal architecture he maintained for keeping track of who knew what. Finally, "I don't know. Victor knows things he has no obvious way of knowing. It's one of the things about him I never fully resolved. If Victor knows Adrian is alive, the motel is compromised." Damian looked at her. Then he called Adrian. The phone rang 7 times. No answer. They looked at each other in the back of the moving cab, And Elena felt the specific cold of a fear that is different from the physical kind, not the fear of the elevator shaft or the men in the penthouse, but the fear of a mistake you made 30 minutes ago that you can't take back. Damian called again. On the fourth ring, Adrian picked up. "Someone's outside," Adrian said. His voice was completely level. "Black SUV. Been sitting at the lot entrance for 20 minutes. "Don't go outside," Damian said. "I wasn't planning to. We're coming to you. 40 minutes. A pause. I'll be here." Another pause, shorter. "Probably." The line went dead. Damian gave the driver a new address, not the motel, a street two blocks from it, and sat back and stared at the partition between them and the front seat. And Elena watched the city move past the rain-blurred windows and thought about the chain of decisions that had brought them here, each one reasonable in its moment, accumulating into something none of them had fully anticipated. They spotted the SUV from a block away. It was positioned exactly where Adrian had described the lot entrance, angled to cover both exit points, engine off but fogged windows suggesting occupants. One vehicle, maybe two people, maybe three. Damian studied it from the shadow of a closed hardware store doorway. "Victor's?" Elena said. "Victor's style, but not Victor's usual people. His regular crew drives cleaner vehicles." He watched the SUV without blinking. "These are contractors. Someone he called in quickly. Because his regular crew is still in the penthouse." "Yes." He pulled out his phone. A different number this time. A conversation in low, rapid sentences that Elena caught fragments of north side, service door. Now and then he put the phone away. 2 minutes, he said. "For what?" "For the SUV to become someone else's problem." She almost asked. Then she decided she didn't want to know. That was the old decision, the 12-year decision, the one she'd made so many times it had grooves worn into it. She recognized it now with a clarity that was almost funny, the precise moment of choosing not to know because not knowing was easier. She made herself ask, "Damian, what are you doing?" He glanced at her. "I called someone who owes me. They're going to tap the SUV's rear fender in about 90 seconds. Not hard, just enough to require an interaction." A pause. People who are watching things professionally do not want to be involved in fender benders. It requires them to make decisions about identification. They'll pull out, and if they don't, then we wait them out. He was right about the 90 seconds. A delivery truck, genuinely random looking, nothing remarkable, reversed out of a space on the far side of the lot a little too wide, and caught the SUV's rear quarter with a sound that was exactly as described, not hard, just enough. The SUV's doors opened. 2 men got out. They were professional looking, in the way of people who try to look unremarkable and mostly succeed, and they stood by their vehicle, doing exactly what Damian had predicted, calculating the cost of the interaction against the cost of staying on task, and after 40 seconds of this, the driver made a gesture that needed no translation, and they got back in and pulled out of the lot. Damian moved immediately. They went around the back of the motel, through an exterior corridor to Adrian's room. Adrian opened the door before they knocked. He had heard them coming, or he'd been standing close enough to the door that the sound carried. He was fully dressed, the way he'd been fully dressed all day, the way Elena suspected Adrian Cross was always fully dressed, sleeping in clothes, or not sleeping, or some combination of the two that had become indistinguishable from habit over 20 years of being nobody in a series of unfamiliar places. He looked at them, at the ledger under Damian's arm. "You got it," he said. "We got it," Elena said. They went inside. The room was small enough that 3 people made it feel crowded. Adrian sat on the edge of the bed. Elena took the chair. Damian stood. He rarely sat in rooms like this. Elena had learned, rooms with limited exit routes. Standing was a form of readiness he couldn't seem to turn off. He set the ledger on the table. Adrian reached for it. Damian put his hand on it first. Not forceful. Just a placement. A pause. The 2 brothers looked at each other across the table. "Before you go through it," Damian said, "there are things in there that..." He stopped. Tried again. "There are things I need you to understand the context of before you draw conclusions." Adrian looked at the hand on the ledger. "I'm not here to judge you," he said. "That's not what I'm worried about." Damian took his hand off the ledger. "I'm worried you'll see something and make a move before I can explain it. And the wrong move right now gets all of us killed." A silence. "All right," Adrian said. "Talk." Damian sat down. Elena watched the effort of it, the physical act of Damian Cross, sitting down in a motel chair, in a room that smelled of carpet cleaner and age, putting the ledger on the table between himself and the brother he hadn't spoken to in 20 years, and beginning to talk. He talked for almost an hour. Not all of it was easy to listen to. Some of it was the specific, difficult ugliness of a man accounting for decisions he had made from positions of fear and expediency, using the honest language of someone who had run out of alternatives to honesty. There were things he had done not Victor's crimes, his own that were neither dramatic nor easy to dismiss. A judge pressured. A witness moved out of the country. Money run through accounts that funded things he had told himself not to look at too closely. The small corrosions of a conscience accommodating a life it should have refused. Adrian listened. Elena listened. Neither of them interrupted. When Damian finished, he looked at the ledger. Victor's accounts start on page 47. The notation system is his. He used a different cipher from mine. I spent 6 months decoding it after I got the ledger from one of his people who came to me 3 years ago. One of his people who'd figured out what Victor was planning and didn't want to be standing next to him when it happened. "What's on page 47?" Adrian said. "Evidence of 41 separate transactions over 19 years. Money moved to accounts Victor controls personally, run through the organization's legitimate front companies, without any notation in the accounts I was given access to." Damian paused. "And at the back of the ledger, the last 12 pages are records of deaths. Not from our organization's direct activity. Contracted deaths. People Victor had removed who knew too much about either the original crime or his parallel operation." Adrian was quiet. 6 people, he said. "Yes." "Who?" Damian listed them, quietly, name by name. 2 of them Elena had heard of names from the peripheral world she'd occupied as Damian's wife. 4 she didn't recognize. Adrian's face changed slightly at the 5th name. "Marcus Webb," Adrian said. "You knew him? He helped me disappear. In the first year, he knew where I went and how." Adrian's jaw tightened. "I lost contact with him in 2009. I thought he'd moved on." 2009 is when his name appears in the ledger, a silence that had a different quality from all the previous ones. Heavier, more specific, the silence of a man revising his understanding of something personal. Elena watched Adrian absorb it, watched the stillness that was not composure, but its opposite, a man holding very still, because movement might break something. "Okay," Adrian said finally. His voice was flat, in a way that meant the opposite of what flatness usually meant. "Okay, then we need to move tomorrow. Tomorrow might be." "Tomorrow," Adrian said, and this time there was something in the word that didn't invite response. Damian looked at him for a moment, then he nodded. They worked on the specifics for another 2 hours. The plan that emerged had, Elena thought, the particular quality of plans made by people who had each spent years learning different aspects of the same problem. There were gaps where their knowledge didn't overlap, and those gaps were concerning. But there was also a kind of comprehensive coverage that none of them could have achieved alone. At some point past midnight, she made coffee from the motel's single-cup machine, and it was terrible, and all 3 of them drank it without comment. At 2 in the morning, Damian looked at Elena. "You should sleep," he said. "So should you. I don't sleep well in small rooms." "You don't sleep well in large rooms either," she said. "I shared a bed with you for 12 years. Something crossed his face. Not quite pain. The particular expression of someone who has had a door briefly opened that they weren't expecting. He looked away. "I'm going to make some calls," he said. "People I trust to move some things into position for tomorrow." He stood. "The room next door is empty." "Elena, take it." He reached into his pocket and put a key card on the table. He had apparently gotten one from somewhere, at some point, without announcing it, which was so completely characteristic of how Damian operated that she almost laughed. "Lock the connecting door." "Damian, please." The word came out with an effort she recognized. Damian Cross did not use please often, and when he did, it was in moments when the architecture of what he was holding together required very careful placement. "I know you're not. I know this isn't just take the room. You need sleep." She picked up the key card. She looked at Adrian, who gave a small nod that conveyed, "I'll be here." Go. She slept 4 hours. Dreamless, the sleep of complete exhaustion. When she woke, it was just after 6 and gray light was coming under the curtains, and for a moment, just a fragment of a moment, she didn't know where she was. Then she remembered. and the weight of all of it came back in a single rush, and she lay on the motel bed in the ivory dress that had survived, more than ivory dresses are generally expected to, and stared at the water stain on the ceiling and thought, today. She got up. She splashed water on her face and looked at herself in the bathroom mirror for a moment, assessing, not judging, the face of a woman who had walked into a situation that had no clean exits, and then she unlocked the connecting door and went through it. The sight that met her stopped her in the doorway. Adrian was at the table. He had the ledger open in front of him and the cassette recorder beside it, and a legal pad covered in notes, and he was bent over all of it with the focused intensity of a man who had been at this for hours. But the sight that stopped her wasn't Adrian. It was Damian, asleep in the chair in the corner. He'd fallen asleep sitting up, his phone in his hand, his head tipped back against the wall at an angle that was going to hurt when he woke. The composure was gone the way composure always goes in sleep. His face was just a face, the lines of it visible in the gray morning light, older than she usually let herself notice, carrying the specific exhaustion of a man who had spent 20 years holding something together that was not meant to hold. She stood in the doorway and looked at him for a moment. Adrian glanced up. She looked away from Damian. "What time did he fall asleep?" she said quietly. "About 4, Adrian said, equally quiet. "He was on the phone until 3:30. She moved to the table, looked at the legal pad. "Find anything new in the ledger?" "More than I expected." Adrian turned several pages back to show her. "Victor's parallel operation isn't just financial. He's been using the organization's infrastructure, transport networks, the front companies, the legal connections to build relationships with a completely separate network. People who have no connection to Damian's world. Independent operators in 3 cities. He tapped a column of names. If Victor makes his move and completes the takeover, he doesn't just inherit Damian's organization. He folds it into something twice the size that he's been building on the side." Elena looked at the names. Some meant nothing to her. 2 of them she recognized, one a name that had appeared in federal investigation news 3 years ago, briefly and inconclusively, and one a name she'd heard Damian mention once as someone he considered off-limits, untouchable, too politically connected to approach. "Victor's been building a bigger empire," she said. Damian's organization was always the piece he needed for the last phase. The part he didn't have: the New York infrastructure, the established political relationships, the brand, if you want to call it that. Adrian closed the ledger. He needed Damian functional long enough to build all of that. Now he doesn't. She sat down. "We need to go to the federal investigators," she said. "Today, with all of this, that's the plan." Damian agreed. "Last night, yes." A pause. "He knows what it means for him." "Does he? He's not Elena." Adrian looked at her carefully. "He's not going to fight you on this. He's not going to do what you think he's going to do." "What do I think he's going to do?" "Try to find a version of this that lets him walk away clean." "He's not going to. He knows too much about what that would require, and he's past that." He seemed to choose the next words deliberately. "My brother has been building toward this for a while. Maybe longer than he's been willing to admit to himself. I think the night you walked out was a kind of permission." She looked at the sleeping man in the chair. "Permission," she said. "To stop," Adrian said simply. She looked away. "I'm going to get coffee," she said. "Real coffee. There's a place across the street. Take your phone." "I was going to." She took the key card and went out. The place across the street was a diner, the kind that has been in the same location for 40 years, and shows it in a way that is neither charming nor depressing, just durable. She ordered 3 coffees to go and stood at the counter waiting and looked out the diner's front window at the street. She noticed the car, because it was parked at an angle that made no sense for the space nosed in too far, pointed the wrong direction for the flow of traffic. A dark blue sedan. She couldn't see the plates from this distance. She paid for the coffee. She was picking up the tray when her phone rang. A number she didn't recognize, New York area code. She answered because she had learned in the last 48 hours that not answering was its own kind of decision. Mrs. Cross. A man's voice, unhurried. The particular unhurriedness of someone who is comfortable in the moment they are in. "I think we should talk," she went cold. "Who is this?" "Someone who has been looking forward to this conversation for quite some time." A pause. "I think you know who I am. I think, given everything you've managed to find in the last 8 months, you've probably put my name together by now." Victor Hale. She kept her face still. The diner counter was between her and the window was between her and the street was between her and the motel, and none of those distances felt like enough. "What do you want?" she said. A conversation, a genuine one. His voice had a quality she hadn't anticipated, not cold, not threatening. Almost collegial. The tone of a man who has decided that civility is the most unnerving thing he can offer. "I think you and I have similar interests at this point, actually." "I doubt that." "You want Damian out of your life," Victor said. "You want this finished. You want to walk away from all of it and build whatever comes next." "Yes?" She said nothing. "I want the same things," he said. "I want the ledger. I want the recording. I want Damian to face consequences for what he's built over the past 20 years. I want his organization dismantled." A pause. "We are, Mrs. Cross, surprisingly well aligned. You want the evidence gone so it can't be used against you." "I want resolution," he said smoothly, "which looks different to different people. To you, I imagine, it looks like walking away. To me, it looks like closing a chapter and moving forward." "You had 6 people killed," she said. A silence, different from his other silences. More considered. "Choices were made," he said. "In a context you don't fully understand yet." "I understand enough." "You understand what's in the ledger," he said. "And the recording. And what my former colleague Adrian has told you." A pause. "What you don't understand is what Adrian hasn't told you." She gripped the phone. "What does that mean?" "It means," Victor said very carefully, "that the man you've been cooperating with for the past 24 hours has his own ledger, Mrs. Cross, his own set of choices made under difficult circumstances. And some of those choices involved me directly, cooperatively, over a period of several years that he has not seen fit to mention to you or to his brother." The diner hummed around her. Someone ordered eggs. The coffee machine ran. "You're lying," she said. Victor's voice didn't change. "Ask him about Budapest. Specifically about what happened in Budapest in 2014. Ask him who he was working with, what they were moving, and who got paid." A pause. "Then ask him why he came back now. This specific month. This specific week. I know why he came back. You know what he told you," Victor said. "There's a difference." She was holding the phone hard enough that her fingers ached. "What do you want from me?" she said again. "I want you to take a walk," Victor said. "Right now." "Out of the diner, yes. I know where you are. I've known where you've been since last night. Don't waste time being surprised. Turn left. Walk to the end of the block. There's a black car. Get in. We'll talk for 20 minutes, and then you make your own decision about what to do with what I tell you. You expect me to get in a car with you. I expect you to be the kind of woman who has survived 12 years in Damian Cross's world by making the right call when it counted," Victor said. "And the right call right now is understanding the full picture before you do something irreversible." He paused. "You have the ledger. You have the recording. You have more leverage than you know what to do with. I'm not going to hurt you. Hurting you at this point would be the single dumbest move available to me." She looked out the diner window at the street, at the dark blue sedan parked at its wrong angle. 20 minutes, she said. 20 minutes, he agreed. "And then you decide." She left the 3 coffees on the counter. Victor Hale in person was unremarkable in the way that genuinely dangerous people sometimes are. Medium height, gray at the temples, the face of a man who could sit across from you at a board meeting or for church fundraiser and be completely invisible until he wasn't. The thing you noticed if you were looking was his eyes, not cold exactly, but precise, the eyes of a man who sees measurements where other people see faces. He was alone in the back of the car. She got in. The driver was separated by a partition. "Thank you," he said. "Don't." She sat with her hands in her lap and looked at him directly. "Say what you're going to say." He took a small, slim folder from the seat beside him and held it out. She looked at it without taking it. "Budapest," he said. "June 2014. Adrian Cross, operating under the name Daniel Marsh, one of several identities he's used, coordinated the movement of significant funds through a network of Eastern European front companies. The network was mine. He knew it was mine." Victor kept the folder extended. "He came to me. I didn't find him. He came to me with information about Damian's organization leverage he'd built over years and offered it in exchange for financial infrastructure he could use to fund his own operation." She stared at him. "His own operation," she said carefully. "Adrian Cross has not spent 20 years as a victim, Mrs. Cross. He has spent 20 years building something. Victor set the folder down on the seat between them. What he's built is smaller than what Damian built and structured differently, less visible. Harder to trace, but it is, in its own way, the same category of thing. He has done the same category of thing. You're telling me this to discredit him. I'm telling you this because if you walk into a federal building tomorrow with Adrian Cross beside you and the federal investigators subsequently discover what I'm telling you now, everything you've brought them becomes compromised. Defense attorneys discredit the source, the ledger gets tied up in disputes about chain of custody, and Victor Hale walks because the case was built on the testimony and cooperation of someone with criminal exposure of his own. He paused. I have been in this business for 30 years, Mrs. Cross. I know how these things fall apart. She picked up the folder. She opened it. Inside were documents, financial records, photographs, a handwritten note in what she was fairly certain was Adrian's handwriting, and a series of wire transfer records with dates running from 2013 to 2016. She looked at the photographs. Adrian. Clearly Adrian, though he was using a different name in the documentation. In at least 2 of the photographs, he was with men she didn't recognize. In a third, he was outside a building she thought might be in Eastern Europe somewhere, talking to a man whose back was to the camera, a man who, from the angle and the silver at his temples, looked remarkably like the person sitting across from her. She closed the folder. Why are you showing me this? She said. Because I want this finished, Victor said. I meant that. I'm tired. I've been running this particular play for 20 years, and it has become the word that comes to mind is exhausting. Something in his face shifted. Not remorse, she was not going to attribute remorse to this man, but something that might have been a kind of weariness that had been going on long enough to be distinguishable from performance. I am prepared to cooperate with federal investigators myself, under conditions, with certain protections in place, in exchange for the ledger and the recording, which I want not to bury, but to control to present in a context that allows me to negotiate my own position, rather than being handed to the prosecution undefended. You want to be the one who cooperates first, she said. You want credit for bringing this down. I want survivable outcomes, he said. Yes. She looked at the folder in her lap, and Adrian, she said. Adrian goes down with Damian, Victor said simply. That's the cost. What Adrian has done is real, Mrs. Cross. It's documented. I didn't fabricate the Budapest operation. You can verify every document in that folder independently. If you take Adrian into federal cooperation, and he subsequently gets indicted for his own activities, the case collapses and everyone is worse off. He held her eyes. Or you leave Adrian out of the negotiation. You let the evidence speak for itself without him as a cooperating witness. The ledger and the recording stand on their own. They don't need Adrian's testimony to be credible. They need the right context and the right presentation, which you would provide, which we would provide, he said. Together. She sat in the back of the car and looked at the partition and thought about the moment 40 minutes ago when she'd stood in the doorway of the motel room and watched Damian Cross asleep in a chair and thought that he looked like a man who had been holding something together for too long. She thought about Adrian at the table, the legal pad, the names, Marcus Webb, who had helped him disappear in 2009 and turned up in Victor's ledger as a contracted death. She thought about the question she hadn't thought to ask, why Adrian had come back now. This specific week, this specific sequence of events. She thought about the 20 years of patience Adrian had described and the specific word he'd used, patience, not grief, not rage, not justice. Patience. The word of a man who has been waiting for a particular moment. She looked at Victor. Give me the folder, she said. It's yours, and I walk out of this car right now. You were always going to walk out of this car, he said. That was the point. She opened the door. The street outside was just a street. Morning traffic, a man walking a dog, the particular indifferent aliveness of a city that does not concern itself with individual crises. She got out. She stood on the sidewalk. She looked at the folder in her hands, and at the motel across the street, and at the window of the room where Adrian was still bent over the ledger, building the case for a version of events that if Victor was telling the truth, even partial truth, was built on a foundation he had deliberately concealed from everyone in that room. She stood there for a long moment in the morning cold. Then she walked back across the street with the folder in her hands, and her face set in something nothing like what she usually felt when she was certain about what she was doing, because she was not certain, would not be certain, had left certainty somewhere back in that elevator shaft, or maybe back on that anniversary night when she'd put the ring on the table. She pushed open the door to Adrian's room. Both brothers looked up at her. She set Victor's folder on the table between them. Looked at Adrian. Budapest, she said. 2014. Tell me everything. The silence that followed was the most telling silence she had experienced in 3 days of silences, because it was the silence of a man who was not surprised. And a man who is not surprised by a question is a man who has been waiting for it. The voice on the phone belonged to a man named Gerald Pace. He explained in the measured tones of someone who had rehearsed this call several times before making it. A forensic accountant who had worked for Damian's organization for 11 years in a capacity so carefully structured that his name appeared nowhere in any ledger, any payroll, any document that had ever been submitted to any regulatory body. He was 61 years old, and he had a heart condition diagnosed 8 months ago that had, he said without self-pity, clarified certain priorities. The storage unit, Elena said. Tell me about the storage unit. It was registered under a name not Damian's, not any alias connected to the organization, belonging to a woman named Catherine Marsh. Catherine Marsh was 83 years old and lived in assisted care in White Plains and had no idea her name was attached to anything. Because the name had been borrowed from a document Gerald himself had processed 17 years ago and never returned. Inside the storage unit was a secondary set of financial records. Not Victor's parallel ledger, not Damian's primary accounts. Something else, a third layer, that neither Victor nor the investigators currently working through the submitted ledger knew existed. What's in it, Elena said. Evidence, Gerald said, that Victor Hale has been for the past 7 years providing information to a federal investigation. Not the investigation currently running, a different one. A closed one. One that ended 4 years ago with several significant prosecutions. A pause. Victor has been an informant, not a passive one. An active, compensated, protected informant. And the terms of his arrangement included provisions that would, if properly invoked, provide him with a degree of immunity that the evidence you submitted today may not be sufficient to overcome. Elena sat on the bench and felt the specific cold of information that makes the ground you're standing on feel less certain than it did 30 seconds ago. He wasn't running, she said. He was going to Newark to retrieve the documentation of his informant status, Gerald said. The physical file, the original signed agreements. He would have submitted it alongside his cooperation statement, and the prosecutors would have faced a very complicated legal landscape. But he was arrested before he got there. Yes, and the file is still in the storage unit. Yes. She gripped the phone. Why are you telling me this? A pause. Because I have spent 11 years doing work that I understood was wrong, and I did it anyway. Because the money was extraordinary, and I told myself it didn't touch anyone directly, Gerald said. And then I got a diagnosis that made that story very hard to keep telling. He paused again. And because Damian Cross, whatever else he is, kept a promise to me once at significant personal cost. And Victor Hale had a man named Marcus Webb killed in 2009 because he knew too much. Marcus Webb was my cousin. Elena closed her eyes. Opened them. Give me the address, she said. She called Carver from the cab. Carver listened without interrupting, which Elena was coming to understand was one of her more useful qualities, and when Elena finished, there was a silence of about 4 seconds. Don't go to the storage unit alone, Carver said. I'm not planning to. Where are you right now? A cab heading to Brooklyn Methodist. Another pause. Ms. Conscious, Elena said. You told me the surgery was successful. I need 5 minutes with him, and then you can send whoever you want to the storage unit. But I need to talk to Damian first. She could hear Carver weighing it. I'll have agents meet you at the hospital, Carver said finally. Do not go anywhere near that storage facility before they've secured it. Agreed. She put the phone in her lap. Outside the cab window, Brooklyn came up around her as they crossed the bridge, the specific different texture of it, lower and wider than Manhattan. The water behind them, catching the last of the afternoon light and throwing it back in broken pieces. She thought about Gerald Pace and his heart condition and his cousin, and 11 years of work he'd known was wrong. She thought about the specific way people bargained with themselves over long periods of time, The internal accounting that made bad choices sustainable. The story you kept revising to stay ahead of what you actually knew. She had done it too. She knew that now with a clarity she could not have managed a year ago. She had done her own version of it for 12 years. Smaller in scale and consequence, but not different in kind. The cab stopped. Brooklyn Methodist smelled like every hospital antiseptic and recycled air, and something's underneath both of those that was just the smell of bodies in proximity to their own fragility. Elena walked through the lobby and found the nurse's station and gave Damian's name, and the nurse looked at her and then at a note on the desk and said, "He's been asking for you." She stopped. "He's been asking for me. Since he came out of recovery, yes." She stood at the nurse's station for a moment with that information. Then she walked to the room. He was in a bed by the window. The Brooklyn evening through the glass was going dark blue, and the room had that particular hospital quality of being simultaneously too bright and somehow dim. His left shoulder was bandaged heavily, and there was an IV in his right arm, and he looked smaller than she expected. Not weak, not diminished exactly, but reduced to a scale that was more purely human than she was accustomed to seeing him occupy. He was awake. He looked at her when she came in, and something moved across his face that he didn't try to control. She pulled the chair close to the bed and sat. Neither of them said anything for a moment. Then Damian said, his voice rough from anesthesia, and whatever came before it, "You got there." "We got there. Has the ledger and everything else." "Victor is in custody." She paused more. "Some things I need to tell you." "Tell me." She told him about Gerald Pace, about the storage unit, about Victor's informant file. She watched him process it, the characteristic internal movement of a man rearranging a picture, finding where the new pieces fit, and when she finished, he looked at the ceiling. "Of course," he said quietly. "Of course he had a backup position." "It doesn't change the outcome," she said. "Carver's people are securing the unit. The immunity agreements Victor signed with a different task force. Carver said that kind of arrangement doesn't automatically extend to the crimes documented in the current investigation. It complicates things. It doesn't end them. Victor knows that." "Yes." "Which means he knew when he showed you that folder and offered you the deal that he had a fallback position. He was negotiating from strength even then." "Yes." Damian made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "He's very good," he said. Not admiration. Just the flat acknowledgement of someone who has spent 20 years with a particular adversary and can be honest about their qualities. "He's in custody," Elena said again. "Whatever he has, he's in custody." Damian turned his head to look at her. "Adrian," he said. "In federal holding. He's been talking to them all afternoon." She paused. He didn't hold anything back. Not about Budapest, not about the parallel operation, not about Victor. All of it. Damian looked at the window. "He's going to be charged," he said. "Probably." "Yes. How bad?" "I don't know yet." Carver said the cooperation is meaningful. The Budapest operation didn't directly result in any deaths. That's different from Victor's situation. And the fact that he came back, that he assembled the evidence and brought it in. She paused. "It's not nothing." Damian nodded slowly. The movement made him wince the shoulder, the particular physics of a gunshot wound reminding him of its presence. She watched him absorb the wince and suppress it, and she thought about how many times she had watched him do that, over 12 years absorb pain and suppress it, and continue, the body made subordinate to whatever the moment required. She had always found it impressive. Now it just looked like one more way he'd never learned to let anything show until it had no choice. "Damian," she said. He looked at her. "Your attorney needs to structure your cooperation so that what you give them is complete and what you ask for is realistic." She said it clearly, the way you talk to someone who needs information rather than management. "You're not going to walk away from this. You know that." "I know that. I need to hear you say it without the qualifier." He held her eyes. "I'm going to prison," he said. "Yes." "For a significant period of time." "Yes." He looked at the window again. The fortune he started. Already being addressed. "Carver has forensic accountants going through the accounts. What's seized gets seized. What can be directed to restitution funds should be." She paused. "Gerald Pace is going to cooperate fully. He knows the accounts better than anyone." Damian absorbed that Gerald. "He has a heart condition." "He's done." He was always— Damian stopped. He was always more decent than the work required. Elena said nothing. After a moment Damian said, "The penthouse." "The properties." Whatever's left, I don't want lawyers fighting over it for years. I want it structured cleanly, and I want the families impacted by the organization's activities to receive whatever can be recovered. I'll make sure your attorney understands that. Not through attorneys? He looked at her. You. She met his eyes. Damian, I'm not asking you to come back, he said. Directly, without decoration. I know what I'm not asking. I'm asking you as someone who knows where everything is, who understands the structure better than anyone else and is in a position to be trusted with it, to oversee the process. You don't have to speak to me. You don't have to be anywhere near me. Just make sure it's done right. She looked at him for a long time. Why me, she said. You have lawyers. Because my lawyers have spent 12 years helping me protect the organization, he said. You spent 8 months looking for the truth. Those are different orientations. She sat with that. All right, she said finally. A silence settled between them, not uncomfortable, not comfortable. Something more specific than either. The silence of two people who have said the significant things and are now in the territory of what comes after significant things, which is always quieter and more uncertain than the significant things themselves. The night you left, Damian said. The anniversary dinner. We don't have to, I need to say it. He said it simply, without the usual infrastructure of control. The pasta, the dress, the ring on the table, a pause. I knew when I saw the table that something was finished. Before you said a word, I knew. He looked at his hands on the blanket, one bandaged arm, one with an IV, both still. I was relieved. She looked at him. Relieved, she said carefully. That someone had finally forced it. He held her eyes. I had been waiting for something to make it stop. For 20 years I had been waiting for something to make it stop, and I didn't know how to make it stop myself, because stopping meant accounting for all of it. And I didn't know how to do that. And now? He looked at the window, at the dark blue Brooklyn evening. Now I don't have a choice, he said. And it turns out that's the only version of this I was ever going to be able to manage. She sat with that. She thought about what Adrian had said in the car, that the night Elena walked out had been a kind of permission. She thought about the ivory dress and the cold pasta and the ring making its small sound on the table, and she thought about how the most significant moments almost always feel, in the living of them, like something slightly too ordinary for the weight they're actually carrying. I'm not going to forgive you, she said, not today. Maybe not. She paused. I don't know when or if, but I'm not doing this helping with the restitution process. Whatever comes next, I'm not doing it as a step toward anything between us. I need you to understand that. I understand it. You're not waiting for me, I know, because I'm not coming. His face. She watched his face receive that, and she watched him do the thing she'd watched him do, 12 years without ever quite naming, take something painful into the body, absorb it, and hold it there without letting it show fully. Except this time, something showed. A small fracture at the edge of his expression. Not performance, not control. Just a man in a hospital bed in the wreckage of 20 years, hearing the thing he already knew confirmed by the one person whose confirmation made it permanent. I know, he said again. Quieter. She stood, she picked up her bag. At the door she stopped, which was becoming a pattern in this story. The door, the pause, the last look. She looked at him. He looked back. You were not a bad man who did bad things, she said. You were a frightened man who made the same bad choice. So many times it became a life. She paused. That's worse and better at the same time. I think you know that. He said nothing. She walked out. The storage unit took 2 hours to process. Carver called her at 9 that evening to confirm what Gerald had described: the informant file, the immunity agreements, the additional records, and to say that the U.S. Attorney's Office was confident that the scope and severity of the crimes documented in the current investigations superseded the protections Victor had negotiated with the previous task force. He's not walking, Carver said. Are you certain? I'm a federal agent, Ms. Voss. I'm never certain. But I'm close. Elena was in a hotel room she'd checked into, with a card she'd had since before her marriage. A card she'd kept in the lining of a bag Damian had never looked through. It was a small thing, that card. She had never thought about why she kept it separate. Now she understood it had been a kind of preparation not conscious, not planned, but the deep instinct of someone who always at some level had known she would eventually need to move alone. She ordered food she barely tasted. She took a shower that lasted a long time. She sat on the hotel bed, in the silence of a room that contained only herself, and felt not relief, Not yet, but the first edges of something quieter than anything she'd felt in 3 days, which was as close to rest as she was going to get tonight. She called her sister. Not to explain, the explaining would take weeks, probably months, and the phone at 11 at night was not the venue for it. Just to hear a voice that knew her from before any of this. Her sister answered on the third ring, surprised, and Elena said, "I'm okay. I'll explain everything soon. I just needed to call someone." Her sister, who was the kind of person who understood when to ask and when not to, said, "Okay, I'm here." They talked for 20 minutes about nothing in particular. When Elena hung up, she sat for a long time in the quiet hotel room and let the quiet be what it was. 6 months moved through Elena's life, with the particular pace of the aftermath of catastrophic events slower than normal time, heavier, full of the bureaucratic and emotional labor that doesn't make for dramatic stories, but constitutes most of what the word recovery actually means in practice. She hired her own attorney. A woman named Diane Park, who had a reputation for protecting witnesses in complex federal cases, and who had, in their first meeting, listened to Elena's account of the past year without visible surprise, and then said, "You're going to be fine. This is going to be exhausting, and then you're going to be fine." She testified 3 times. Once in the preliminary hearings on Victor Hale's case, once in the proceedings against the remaining senior members of the organization, and once in a deposition that lasted 9 hours and concerned primarily the financial structure of the front companies and what she had known and when. Victor Hale was convicted on 14 counts. The immunity agreement from the previous task force was challenged, litigated for 2 months, and ultimately ruled insufficient to cover the crimes documented in the current case. His attorneys appealed. The appeal was denied. He received a sentence that his own attorneys described, in comments to the press that Elena read in a hotel room in another city, as excessive. Elena did not have a strong reaction to this description. Adrian Cross pleaded to reduce charges in exchange for his comprehensive cooperation. His sentencing hearing involved testimony from Carver and 2 other agents about the significance of his contribution to the case. He received a sentence that allowed, given time served, and the cooperation credit, for a release date approximately 3 years out. Elena attended the sentencing. She sat in the back of the courtroom and watched Adrian receive the judgment with the stillness that had become familiar to her over 3 days ago in motels and cars and federal corridors. When it was done, he looked out at the courtroom and found her face and gave her a nod that was small and complete, and she nodded back. Damian's cooperation process was the longest and most complex. He had the most to account for, the most to provide, and the most leverage to negotiate with, which was, Elena thought, a fitting summary of his entire life. His attorney structured the cooperation over 4 months of meetings with federal investigators, and the resulting sentencing agreement reflected a man who had given the government everything they asked for, and then some. She did not attend his sentencing. She watched the coverage that evening, on the news in her apartment, the apartment she'd rented in November, 3 months after leaving the penthouse, in a neighborhood she'd chosen specifically because she knew nobody there, and she watched the footage of Damian coming out of the courthouse in the handcuffs she'd known were coming, and she felt a complicated thing that had no clean name. He didn't look at the cameras. He looked at the middle distance the way people do when they're going somewhere, and need to concentrate on the going. She turned off the television. She had taken a job. That surprised her more than anything else, the ease of it, the rightness of it. A nonprofit organization that provided legal navigation services to families affected by organized crime, helping them understand the restitution processes, the victim compensation funds, the various bureaucratic structures that were theoretically available to them, but practically inaccessible without significant expertise. A woman named Rosa, who had built the organization over 12 years from a folding table in a church basement to an actual office with an actual staff, had approached her through Diane Park. "You know more about how these organizations actually function than anyone I've ever talked to," Rosa had said, "and you have no personal stake in protecting anyone in them anymore. That's a rare combination." Elena had said she'd think about it. She'd thought about it for 1 week and then called Rosa's back. The work was not glamorous. It was forms and phone calls, and the specific careful labor of helping people understand what they were entitled to and how to ask for it. which required both detailed knowledge of complex systems and the ability to sit with people who were angry and exhausted, and often did not want the help in the form it was being offered. Elena found she was good at it in a way that had something to do with 12 years of being in rooms where she had to read situations quickly and say the right thing under pressure, applied now to an entirely different purpose. She worked hard. She slept better than she had in years. She made friends slowly, Rosa, and a woman at the organization named Yolanda, who made terrible coffee and was one of the funniest people Elena had ever encountered, and a neighbor in her building, an older man named Frank, who grew tomatoes on his fire escape and left them outside her door without explanation, which she appreciated more than she would have predicted. She did not start over. She did not use that language, even to herself. Starting over implied that what had come before was without value, and she did not believe that. Could not make herself believe it, even in the moments when she wanted to, the moments when she looked at 12 years and tried to assess what they had cost and what they had cost and what they had given her, and found the accounting too complicated to resolve. She had learned things. Some of them she wished she hadn't needed to learn. Some of them she needed and was glad to have. She moved forward. That was the language she used. The letter arrived on a Tuesday in February. No return address. The handwriting on the envelope was controlled and familiar, and she recognized it before she turned it over. She stood in her apartment hallway in her coat, just home from work, holding the letter for a long time before she opened it. It was 2 pages, handwritten. The handwriting of a man who had been practicing something. She could see it in the letters, the deliberate quality of someone slowing themselves down. He didn't explain himself. He didn't list things he'd done wrong. He didn't ask for anything. He wrote the way someone writes when they've been in a very quiet place for a long time and have finally found the words for something that has been sitting in them inarticulate. He wrote about what the quiet was like, about the particular enforced stillness of the life he was in now, and what he was finding in that stillness which surprised him. He wrote that he had started reading not business, not anything strategic, just reading, books from the facility library, fiction mostly, which he had never had patience for before. He had read a novel about a woman who survives a shipwreck and builds a life on an unfamiliar coast, and something in it had hit him in a way he didn't entirely understand but felt was important. He wrote that he had finally stopped being afraid. Not of prison, not of the law or the public record of his name or the loss of the empire, of becoming his father. He had spent 30 years afraid of that, in a way he had never fully articulated to himself, and the fear had driven choices that had made the thing he feared more likely rather than less, and he understood that now, with the kind of clarity that only comes after you've run out of the motion that let you avoid understanding it. He wrote, "I think you saw that in me before I did. I think that's partly why you stayed as long as you did and entirely why you left when you did. I'm not thanking you for it. That would be a way of making it about me. I'm just saying I see it." He did not ask her to write back. He said he hoped the work she was doing was what she needed it to be. He said he hoped she was warm. She stood in the hallway of her apartment and read the letter twice and then folded it and held it for a moment, just the physical object of it, paper and ink and the particular effort of a man trying to say something real. She put it in the drawer of the small table by her window. Not the trash, not a box in the closet. The drawer she used, the one she opened. She took her coat off. She made tea. She sat at the window with the tea and looked out at the street below her street. Now, the street she walked every day. The street she was beginning to know the rhythms of. The particular dog that was walked at 7:15 every morning, and the couple who argued quietly on the stoop of the building opposite on Thursday evenings, and the teenager who sat on the fire escape, 2 buildings down playing guitar badly, and, without self-consciousness, which Elena found, every time she heard it, unexpectedly moving. She thought about the letter. She thought about the woman in the novel Damian had described, building a life on an unfamiliar coast. She hadn't read the book. She thought she might. She thought about Damian in a facility somewhere in this state, reading fiction for the first time in his life, finding something in it that surprised him. She held that image for a moment, not with grief, not with anger, with something more neutral than both. The honest acknowledgement that a human life is rarely simple enough to be only one thing, that the man who had caused real harm to real people was also the man who had called in his own shooting rather than call his own people, who had written 2 pages by hand about a shipwreck novel, who had looked at his wife across an anniversary table and felt, underneath the fear, something that might have been relief. She didn't forgive him. She didn't know yet if she ever would, and she was trying to be honest with herself about that uncertainty rather than resolving it in either direction prematurely. But she held the image without needing to do anything with it. That was something. 3 weeks later, she got a call from Adrian. He had been transferred to a minimum security facility in Connecticut and was allowed calls on weekday afternoons. His voice sounded different on the phone than it had in the motels, and the cars less compressed, she thought. Less like a man holding himself to a particular shape. "I've been thinking about what you said," he told her. "About all of it, the way it went." "What have you been thinking?" "That I did what I thought I had to do," he said, "and that some of it I'd do the same way again, and some of it I wouldn't." A pause. "I'm trying to be honest about which parts are which." "That sounds right," she said. "I wanted to apologize to you," he said. "Specifically and not generally. I used you. I knew what I was doing when I made contact with you, and I used your situation and your intelligence and your access to Damian to run a play I'd been building for 2 years. That's the truth of it." "Yes," she said, "and I'm sorry." She sat with it. "I know you are," she said. "I think that's real. But it doesn't change what I did." "No," she said. "It doesn't." "A silence. Damian wrote to you," he said. "Yes." "He wrote to me too." Another pause. "We're figuring out what that is. What we are to each other now. It's strange. We write letters like two people who met recently and are being careful." "Maybe that's accurate," she said. "Maybe." He sounded like he was considering it. "He told me about the shipwreck novel." She almost smiled. "He's been sending me recommendations," Adrian said. "Books." 3 letters, and all 3 have book recommendations in them. A pause that had something warmer in it than most of Adrian's pauses. "I don't know what to do with that." "Read them," she said. "Probably." He was quiet for a moment. "Are you okay?" he said. "Actually." She looked out her window at the street. The bad guitar teenager was at it again on the fire escape, working through something that might eventually become a recognizable song. "Yes," she said, "actually." "Good," he said. They said goodbye. She put the phone down. Outside, the teenager hit a chord that finally landed right just the one, clean and brief before dissolving back into approximation, and Elena heard it through the glass and felt, without planning to, a small unexpected thing that might have been happiness, or the beginning of it, or something close enough to count. She turned from the window. She had work in the morning. She went to bed, and the city went on outside her window the way cities do, indifferent and alive, and full of people moving through their particular versions of the same human struggle, all of them carrying their histories, all of them trying to figure out which parts of those histories they could set down, and which ones they would carry forever. And outside Elena's window on the fire escape, 2 buildings down, the teenager played on into the dark, getting a little better, failing a little, trying again. That was all any of it was, trying again. Elena went back to work the next morning, the way she had gone back to work every morning. For the past 6 months on foot the long way, 40 minutes instead of 20, because the long way took her through the park, and the park had become necessary to her in a way she hadn't anticipated and couldn't entirely explain. It wasn't the greenery, it wasn't even the quiet, because the park at 8 in the morning was not particularly quiet dog walkers and joggers, and the particular aggressive cheerfulness of people who exercise before 9, plus the ambient noise of the city pressing in from all sides, the park merely a pause in it rather than an escape. It was something else. The specific act of walking somewhere on her own 2 feet through open air, with no destination except the destination she'd chosen. 12 years of cars. 12 years of drivers who knew where she was going before she said it, who held doors and navigated and delivered her to the specific coordinates of her husband's life. She had not understood, until she stopped, how much of her own movement had been managed for her. How rarely she had simply walked somewhere because she wanted to. She walked. The park in February had the stripped-down quality of things that aren't performing for anyone. Trees without leaves, paths without the softening effect of summer green. Just the bare structure of the thing, visible and functional, which Elena found more honest than the summer version, and therefore more comfortable. She stopped at the same bench. She stopped it every morning. It faced a small pond that had a thin skin of ice at the edges this time of year. She sat for 10 minutes and drank coffee from the thermos she'd started carrying in November and did not look at her phone. This was the practice. 10 minutes, no phone, the pond, the coffee. She had not been a person who had practices before. She had been a person who moved through other people's structures, adapting. Now she was building her own, one small, deliberate thing at a time. And the smallness of each individual thing was the point. She wasn't trying to construct a life from the top down, from some grand vision of who she was going to be. She was building it from the bottom, from the 10-minute bench and the long walk and the terrible coffee at the office that she drank anyway, because Yolanda made it, and complaining about it had become its own form of companionship. She sat on the bench. The ice on the pond edge caught the morning light and held it in a way that was briefly beautiful and gone as soon as you tried to look at it directly. She thought about Adrian's call, about his voice and the difference in it, about the book recommendations Damian was sending him and what it meant, not symbolically, not as a gesture toward redemption or reconciliation, but what it actually meant in the practical day-to-day terms of two men who had destroyed each other's lives, figuring out whether there was anything left that could be called a relationship. She thought it probably looked like what Adrian had described, two people being careful with each other, writing letters, recommending books, the tentative architecture of something new built on the rubble of something old. She didn't know if it would hold. She thought it might be enough that they were trying. She finished her coffee. She stood, she walked to work. Rosa was already in when Elena arrived, which was typical. Rosa operated on a schedule that seemed to predate normal human waking hours, and she never commented on it, never asked anyone else to match it, just existed in the office in the early morning, like a piece of furniture that had always been there. "There's someone waiting for you," Rosa said, without looking up from her screen. "Conference room. She's been here since 7:45. "Who? Wouldn't give a name. Said you'd know her." Rosa looked up then. "She looks like she hasn't slept in 2 days." Elena took off her coat. The woman in the conference room was maybe 35. Dark hair, pale from what appeared to be genuine exhaustion rather than coloring, wearing clothes that had been good clothes recently and were now the clothes of someone who had been wearing them for too long. She was sitting at the conference table with her hands wrapped around a paper cup of the terrible coffee, and she looked up when Elena came in with the alert, hollowed look of someone running on will and very little else. "Ms. Voss," she said. "Yes, my name is Petra Hale." Elena sat down. Petra Hale had the bone structure of her father. Elena could see it, the particular architecture of the face, the precision of the eyes. But where Victor's eyes had been cold in their precision, this woman's were burning. Not with rage. With the desperate intensity of someone who has been carrying something very heavy for a very long time and is approaching the end of their ability to carry it. "Victor's daughter," Elena said. "Yes." She paused. "I know what that name means to you. I know what he did. I'm not here to defend him." Her hands tightened on the cup. "I'm here because I have something you need to know, and I've been trying to figure out for 3 weeks who to tell, and your name kept being the one I came back to." Elena looked at her. "Tell me," she said. Petra had known about her father for 8 years. Not all of it, she was precise about that distinction. Spoke it carefully. The practiced precision of someone who has drawn a line in their own understanding and needs others to see it clearly. She had known he was not legitimate. She had known the money was not clean. She had not known about the 6 deaths until the prosecution coverage, which she had read in its entirety, alone in her apartment, over 3 days that she described as the worst of her life. What she had that Elena needed to know was this. Her father, in the year before his arrest, had been systematically transferring assets into structures that predated his informant agreement with the previous task force. Structures that the current prosecutors were not, as far as Petra could determine, aware of. She had found the documentation going through her father's home office. After his arrest, she had been his emergency contact, had legal access to his residence, had gone in to collect practical items, and found instead a secondary filing system inside a piece of furniture that looked like a decorative cabinet and was not. Inside was documentation of assets totaling, by Petra's rough accounting, which she admitted was not professional, somewhere between $40 and $60 million. Held in structures that Victor had specifically designed to survive his prosecution intact. He was planning for after, Petra said. Whatever happened to him legally, he intended to have resources waiting on the other side. Elena looked at her. "You're bringing this to us," she said. "Not to a lawyer, not to the prosecutors directly. To us, because those families," Petra stopped, steadied herself. the restitution funds, the families your organization works with. Some of the money in those structures is money that should have gone to them. That was taken and moved and hidden. Her jaw was tight. I know I can't undo what he did. I know there's nothing I can undo. But this I can do. If it gets to the right people and those families receive what they should have received, that's something. It's also evidence against your father in an ongoing legal matter, Elena said carefully. You understand that? Yes. You're prepared for what that means. Petra looked at her with the eyes that burned without heat. My father destroyed people's lives for 30 years, she said. I have spent 8 years understanding that slowly and 3 weeks understanding it completely. I am prepared for what it means. Elena sat for a long moment. Then she said, I'm going to call our attorney and Agent Carver simultaneously. You'll need to be interviewed. It will be thorough and it will not be comfortable. I know, and I'd recommend you get your own legal counsel before that interview. Not after, before. Petra nodded. Thank you, Elena said, for coming here. Petra looked at her hands. I didn't have anywhere else to go, she said. She stopped. I mean that I'd looked at every other option, and they all felt like continuing something I needed to stop. She looked up. Does that make sense? Elena thought about the night she had stood in a storage room in her husband's building, looking at a seam in the drywall, deciding what kind of woman opens hidden things. Yes, she said, it makes sense. The next 6 weeks were the kind of exhausting that doesn't show on the outside. Calls with Carver, meetings with Diane Park, the careful documentation of Petra Hale's information, the legal maneuvering required to enter it into the proceedings against Victor in a way that was clean and usable, the cross-referencing of the asset structures against the organization's financial history. The assets were real. $43 million, ultimately, held across 11 separate structures in 4 jurisdictions. The process of reaching them was long and involved international legal cooperation that moved at the pace of such things, which was glacial, but it moved. 3 months later, Elena sat in Rosa's office and watched Rosa read the letter from the U.S. Attorney's Office, confirming the first transfer, $8 million, the first tranche of what would come, directed to the restitution fund their organization administered. Rosa read it twice. Then she set it down and looked at Elena. $8 million, she said. First tranche, Elena said. More coming. Rosa looked at the letter again. Petra Hale, she said. Petra Hale, Elena confirmed. Rosa was quiet for a moment. Then this work, she said. This specific work. Do you know how many families this reaches? Elena knew the numbers. She had run them in the weeks since Petra had walked in. She didn't say them out loud because they were large, and saying large numbers out loud sometimes flattened them rather than the opposite. I know, she said. Rosa looked at her with the assessing quality she always had. The look of a woman who has been doing difficult work for 12 years and knows what it costs. You're staying, Rosa said. Yes, Elena said. Rosa nodded once with the finality of something settled. In April, Elena received a second letter from Damian. This one was shorter. 1 page. The handwriting was looser than the first letter, less practiced, more immediate, as though he'd written it quickly and sent it before he could think about it too much. He wrote that he'd heard through his attorney about the Petra Hale development and the asset recovery and the restitution fund transfer. His attorney had told him the number. He wrote, I don't know how to respond to that except to say that it's more than I managed in 30 years of having the resources to do it. That's not self-pity. That's arithmetic. He wrote that the book recommendations to Adrian had turned into actual letters. Real ones, back and forth, longer than he'd expected. He wrote that Adrian had said something in a recent letter that he was still thinking about, which was that the opposite of the life they'd both lived wasn't safety. It was agency, the ability to make choices that actually belonged to you. He wrote, I'm working on understanding what that means from here. There's a limited version of it available to me right now, but I think understanding the concept is probably the first step. He did not ask about her. She noticed that and recognized it for what it was, a form of respect. The deliberate restraint of a man who had spent a long time centering himself in other people's stories, learning to leave space at the edge of his. She folded the letter. She put it in the drawer with the first one. She went to make tea and stood at the kitchen window of her apartment, in April light the city below her, running with the energy of a season changing, people shedding coats, a quality to the air that was different from yesterday, in a way that was real rather than imagined. And she stood there in the quiet of her own kitchen, in the apartment she had chosen, in the neighborhood she was beginning to love for its specific unglamorous aliveness, and she let herself feel the particular contentment of a life that was genuinely hers. Not happy in the simple sense, not uncomplicated. There were things she missed. There were things she grieved. There were nights when she lay awake in the dark and felt the full weight of 12 years pressing down, the specific grief of a future she had imagined that would not happen. The loss not of Damian himself, but of the story she had told herself about who they were and what it meant. She felt all of that. And she also felt this, standing in her kitchen in April light, tea in her hands, the city below her. The bench in the park tomorrow morning, work she was good at. Yolanda's terrible coffee, and Frank's fire-escaped tomatoes, and the teenager's guitar getting incrementally stubbornly better. The life was small in the ways that good lives tend to be small. It did not have the scale of the life she'd left. It did not have the penthouse or the cars or the rooms full of people whose attention converged on her because of who she stood beside. It had her in it, fully, without the management of herself that the other life had required. That was not a small thing. She was learning, the whole thing. She finished her tea. She rinsed the cup. She went to bed. Outside the window of her apartment, the city did what it always did. It kept going, indifferent and relentless and full of people navigating their own versions of the same basic human problem, which was how to live with the choices you'd made and the ones that had been made around you, how to build something real from the materials available, how to keep moving through the dark toward a morning that would come whether you were ready for it or not. The morning always came. Elena Voss had learned to trust that. Not because it solved anything. Not because the morning arrived with answers or resolution or the clean feeling of things properly finished. But because it arrived. Because you were there to see it. Because that in the end was the whole of it. The surviving, the continuing, the putting of one foot in front of the other into a life that was yours and imperfect and real. She slept. Outside the city breathed. And somewhere in it, in the quiet institutional dark of a facility in Connecticut, a man who had spent 30 years building an empire, read a novel about a shipwreck, and found something in it that he hadn't expected and held it carefully, the way you hold something fragile that you're learning to value and did not let it go.